I really appreciate being asked to participate in Tacoma Reads, and thank you. I thank you today for attending my talk. My presentation, I hope, will shed additional light and insight into Isabel Wilkerson's masterful Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. You know, it is fitting that I am speaking to you in a public library. In fact, people are coming in right now. They can check out books, they can open and read a book to their heart's content with or without a library card. This has not always been the case, however. I am the descendant of people for whom it was a crime to read, to write, or have a book in their possession. It was a crime for anyone to teach them how to read or to write. Post-enslavement, during the Jim Crow era, well into civil rights and in the 1960s, while people were being arrested for sitting at lunch counters, people were also being arrested for trying to use the library. Why? Because books transform lives. I transform books. My work is centered on the role of textiles in the transatlantic trade in slaves. I describe this work as the text of textiles. Cloth is code. Cloth transmits information. At a glance, we discern economic status, societal position. Cloth performs as camouflage, mask, a fiction. Cloth defines and assigns a person's place in society. Cloth, as a map, is a language to be read by any traveler. And we shall travel into a past we cannot get past. For we are bound, as a book is bound, along the spine of time. In Book of the Bound, a book's content has been sealed off by cloth, thus silencing its author. A new narrative is created upon its surface. I have altered its history. Slavery alters lives. Slavery alters the life of someone who finds themselves enslaved. Slavery alters the life of an enslaver. Slavery alters societies. It is the ultimate caste system. In the late 16th century, Arab and European travelers described narrow strips of cloth used as a medium of trade. I am so interested in the fact that people were bought and sold for a strip of fabric. These strips were produced on a double-heddle loom, widely used in Africa. Now, Africa has an extensive history in cloth and textiles noted as early as the 9th century. From fine to functional, from complex, intricate designs to just plain cloth. Cloth was woven by both men and women. Fabrics included cotton, silk, wool, goat's hair, and raffia. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the Americas, cloth and dyes represented not only wealth and status, but definitions of hierarchy based on clothing, on how a person was considered dressed or properly clothed. In this work, I am bound to go there. I have retained the illustration of 3 children, an African child and 2 European children. I have redefined this story by inserting a definition, the definition of bound, of which an example of the use in a sentence is, I am bound to go there. I have created a narrative that includes the children and the elephant, because they will all find themselves, well, the elephant's tusk will be bound, but the children in particular, in my rendition of this story, are all going to be bound somewhere. The African child will find himself on a ship, bound for the new world. He will be a slave. The European children, however, will be children of people during the children of people during the enclosure who have been thrown off of the land that was commonly grazed, and they will flood the cities, and the children will find themselves indentured. Children were a considerable part of this trade in conscripting labor from individuals. So where are these children going? I am bound to go there. Where are they bound to go? Well, we would need to come to the back of the book to see that they are bound to a tobacco plantation in Virginia. So the colonial era, there were 4 essential crops. 4 essential crops: tobacco, rice, sugarcane. But cotton had a kingdom. Cotton was king. So, over here, this piece is Forget-Me-Not. It is a plantation piece. On this piece, we find the alligator in the corner, designating that this plantation is near a swamp. In the cartouche, this little square here, we find a crown. And that is because I am not only thinking of King Cotton in his Cotton Kingdom, but the role of royalty, of kings and queens, African, European, Asian, who were participating in the trade. There's also a little charm at the top, a little heart charm. And we can say that the world fell under the spell of cotton. There was a huge demand, not only for the cotton to be produced and shipped and transformed, coming back in terms of cloth, but also dyes were as valuable as gold. I am making, although we don't see, there are bodies on this plantation. These bodies are also clothed. If you were a field hand, you were issued 2 garments for an entire year. Imagine that, 2 garments for an entire year. These garments were called Negro cloth. They were made from very coarse fabric. In fact, fabric in which only enslaved people were assigned to wear, including coarse kersey, coarse printed calico, checked linen, all of the lowest quality. And what did the royals wear? Well, they were dressed in velvet and silk and brocade and satin of the highest quality. In the work, Angel, Smell of Lilac, this is the only work in which I have, I should say, lent my hand. The text has been written over in crayon and ink. I have created a narrative because this woman is writing to her former mistress. The time of this piece is the very, very late 19th century, very, very early 20th century. She is literate. She would be dressed in perhaps cast-offs from her former mistress. She might have calico, but it would be calico of a lower quality. Any person embarking upon a creation will find themselves at the beginning saying, this is what I'm doing. However, at some point, you might find the work taking over, such as this image of that face, which I was not intending to create. I was just marking over the text. But there's a face of a woman, an African woman. And so I compare the people in the fields and the people who worked in the big house. They are descendants of people who survived 12 generations of slavery. Everyone, however, did not survive. Abduction is the last piece I created in the series. And I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. I looked and I saw all these beautiful pieces, all the cloth, and I said to myself, this is an ugly business. Where is the representation of the ugly business? And so, one other thing I want to say, these books, I would go hunt, and I mean hunt books in Goodwill, hunt books in half-price books. Half-price books had, at the front, they had this kind of, where they were, we'll call them kind of toy books or decorative books. You'll see some of these very unusual shapes. So I was looking for form. I was looking for shape. And I didn't know what the book was going to be. It would tell me, this is how we're going to tell this story. So in Abduction, I was thinking of all the people who had perished. As you can see, it's covered with chicken bones. Well, you know, chickens are a sacrificial animal. They're used in a lot of rites. Their blood to as sacrifice to appease the gods. Well, these bones also represent all of the people who sacrificed their lives. They perished in the village when it was raided. They perished along the long, long paths as they made their way from the interior to the coast. They might have been sold 2, 3, 4 times before they even made it to the coast. They perished in the forts and the castles as they waited to be piled into the ships. They perished once they got on the ship. They perished when they got on into the so-called New World and just got off the ship and died. And they died on these plantations. It is a miracle if you think about famine, disease, war, all of these things which we now are very well aware of, perished in a plague. It is amazing that we are alive today because so many people could not and did not survive. They were met with a great hunger, an immense hunger that swallowed whole villages and people alive. This hunger had an immense desire. The ship, the Desire, is the first American colonial built and owned ship of which there is a record in trading in slaves. It was built at Marblehead, Massachusetts. And what was in the ship? But cotton, tobacco, and captive Africans. I was thinking, isn't that amazing that the very first ship of which we have record trading in slaves in what became known as America was called the Desire. It is fitting because there was an immense desire, an immense hunger for what? Well, I started looking. I started thinking about this whole business of ships and shipping. And I found a book, Elizabeth Donnan's Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade. Donnan's work is a 4-volume work. And in it you will find correspondence, the correspondence of companies, company men from the Guinea Company or Company of the Royal Adventurers. You will find invoices and charts and lists of all the sundry items that were shipped to Africa. And once they were offloaded, then you know who was loaded onto those ships. Well, in one of the lists, it had the name of the vessel, it had the captain's name, the date, the port of departure, and the destination. And also they had the list of the number of slaves. And so I was looking at the names of these ships, and just like the ship Desire, I found highly evocative. I found the name of a ship called Merchant Love. Wow. Merchant Love. I was thinking, how interesting that a ship that is transporting bodies with terms of endearment and affection had anything else but in its hold. So I looked for more names, names like Nymph, names like True Love, Ruby. So Delight, Eliza, and my favorite is the Royal consort. Well, who was in the holds of these ships? Once they offloaded the cloth, the guns, cheap metals, all kinds of trinkets, beads, these were offloaded. Delight is another name I thought was really interesting. These names, but who was in the hold of these ships? Well, mostly they were men. There were wars for trade, because what happened is when imported cloth came into Africa, on the coast, the kings, the queens, the villagers wanted the imported cloth. They began to value the imported cloth over the indigenous cloth. And so they would go deep into the interior, raid these villages, and bring men, mostly men in their prime, because they needed these bodies on these plantations. They needed the bodies to clear the land. And so in addition to men in their prime, there were women and there were children. As I have mentioned, I've talked about the royals, kings and queens and kingdoms. I'm going to talk about an empire now, or I should say an emperor. And that emperor is the Emperor Ocean. Every ship that left the port with its hull full of African bodies did not make it to the other side. They could have been captured by pirates. They could have encountered hurricanes. More than once, the slaves rose up and tried to keep the coast in sight. For many of these people, they had never seen so large a body of water. And so, just because you made it on that ship did not mean you were going to make it off. And this was for the Europeans and for the Africans. They say that there was a road of bones, that you could travel that road to see where all the people who perished. There was also a disease that affected the eyes. And if you've ever read any of these narratives from the sea captains and other people who described being on these ships, this disease would affect the eyes and they would blind them. And there are accounts of a ship adrift in the sea, another ship coming upon it, ahoy, calling to them. And when they found out what happened, all of the men, the slaves, all of them were blind. And no one would risk going onto that ship to save them. So in the work, Emperor Ocean, I am saying that the sea was its own empire, and it also did not guarantee safe passage. But I also am referring to women, because in this history, this is my multi-volume set that, as far as I know, does not exist yet, of the role of women in the slave trade and also the role of women in war. Women, as you know, were prevented actually in Europe, in Arab societies, from being able to read and write. So the accounts of women's history really don't start to be read or discussed until the 18th century, and then of course we're into the 19th century. But I'm thinking of the 16th century, the 17th century, of which there's silence. And so I'm hoping in one day that there would be a multi-volume set of this history. How did these women become captured? Well, they brought them across the Sahara in caravans. They brought them down from the deep interior on coffles. And there is one work, the work Caravans, that links both sides of the Atlantic. Here we find in this image, again, the African and the ivory. Now, these were people with skills. You know, they wanted people who worked the rice plantation because those people knew how to grow rice. They needed weavers. They needed people who also were adept at getting this ivory. The Africans who brought the ivory down to the coast would find themselves transporting the ivory, delivering the ivory, and the ivory would be sold, and the Africans would be sold. It was called black ivory. The other thing I want to point out to you is the royal blue here. There's something called sumptuary laws, and sumptuary laws really means that you have to be of a certain class in order to wear a cloth or color. Hence, royal blue was only worn by royals. So we have here images of people in coffles. We have images from an old menu, but when people landed in Charleston, when they landed, in particular in North America, in the Cotton Kingdom, in the South, in the 18th century, there were runaway slave advertisements. Calabar Negro, runaway the 14th, Gambia Negro fella, could speak English. What was interesting about these runaways is that they could speak English, French, and Dutch. And so they were trilingual in European languages. Now, that doesn't account for how many languages, African languages, they've spoken. I used to work with a man from Côte d'Ivoire. He was a janitor. He spoke 6 languages. And so belies the fiction that these people were not intelligent, that they didn't have the capacity. They knew that they had skills, and they needed these skills in the plantation economy in order not only to build and to grow, but also to increase wealth. Now in South Carolina, the Negro Act of 1735, slave garments could only be made of low quality textiles. That includes Osnaburgs, Lindsay Woolsey, duffels, checked cottons, or Scottish plaids. One of my favorites is Fear Not, fear not and dread nothing. Those are names of fabrics. So we're going to go this way. In this work, The Old Chain, I am focusing on East Indian cloth because this cloth was prized. They were sold on the Gidding Coast and to plantation owners in the West Indies. Striped or checked, they were admired for the brightness of their colors. I am making linkages not only between the cloth, but again of the elephants who found themselves being hunted and murdered for their ivory. So we are back in the South. Now, the transatlantic trade was abolished by the British. When that trade was abolished, when it was cut off, there was then an eternal trade that really was ramped up. And this trade, because they needed bodies for these plantations in Mississippi and South Carolina and Georgia, this trade had to be fed. But I want to focus again on women. This work is My Heart Belongs to Daddy. Oh, there's one thing I wanted to say. In that work, Merchant Love, when those people were put on these ships, they were stripped naked. In My Heart Belongs to Daddy, there was the trade, the internal trade, that went from Virginia and selling the people south. But as every woman knows, if you were found naked in the midst of strange men, danger lies. And so these women became pregnant on the ships. They became pregnant on the plantations. And on the plantations, these mixed race children began to form what we know is the caste of skin. And this reached from Africa all through the Americas, north and south. Sometimes in a place like Virginia, let's say, there was a relationship or bond between the master and the slave, in which he wanted to protect the woman and the children, and so he would send them north out of the slave states. But most mixed race children were sold. There was a trade called the fancy trade. It went to all parts south. But we know, for instance, in New Orleans, of Osage, the quadroon balls, of quadroons and octoroons. And so in the piece, My Heart Belongs to Daddy is a kind of grid, a map. And I have to tell you, just the other day, as I was preparing for this, and I thought of this piece, I said, oh, you should have just smashed all those hearts. You should have destroyed them, because this person is not seen as the daughter. She is seen as a piece of property meant to be sold. The last piece is Book of the Bound. Oh, I do want to say one more thing. This woman, in My Heart Belongs to Daddy. These women in the fancy trade, you could tell by their clothing. You could tell, first of all, they reached a higher price than others. And they had clothing that demonstrated their value and their worth. Most people, however, in the trade were abjectly poor and impoverished. The majority of these people were people who were on these plantations. And I am thinking of people from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century who were far off on these plantations. They would not even sometimes know the name or even see the face of the person for whom their bondage was tied. So this book, an old dictionary, the text has been created out of chains. And just like text, some of the chains are bold, some are calligraphic, some are italic. The font is really large or it's very small. John Newton, sea captain and slaver, author of the hymn, Amazing Grace, has a phrase that really answers all of the, how can I say, the condition of people in bondage. He said, "For the slaves lie in two rows, one above the other, on each side of the ship, close to each other, like books on a shelf." Chain Letter of Debtors is an interactive work. It is a ghost chain. I ask anyone who comes, if you come to see the exhibit at the Moore Library, but in past exhibits, I've asked people to write a letter. I'm going to read the statement here. Each one of us is one link in the mighty chain of life, part and participle of the past and the future. Just as the past has shaped our present, we participate fully in shaping this world's destiny. Throughout history, slaves have played and continue to play a pivotal and crucial role in the growth and development of humanity. For us, their unseen hands cleared forests, raised cities and towns, opened roads, laid rails, fed and clothed a nation. They tended to the sick, buried bodies, birthed bodies, carried its burdens, and all secrets keep. We are indebted to them for living in spite of their endless days of bondage. travelers all, aren't we? Along a road called life. Say ye what, traveler, to those long gone lives who lived to make this day possible? There are some touching letters here on the chain. People writing back, people leaving heartfelt messages for the past that we cannot get past. Thank you. So, Marissa,
Carletta, thank you so much. That was an incredible tour of your exhibit.
thank you.
And we
Thank you.
received a lot of great feedback online from
Excellent.
everyone watching.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yes, thank you for being here. And if you're watching a recording of this, thank you for tuning in. We are here again at Moore Library with artist Carletta Carrington Wilson. And this exhibit is here as part of Tacoma Reads 2021. It's going to be on display through November 19th, 2021. So if you're seeing this and there's still time to check it out, we strongly encourage you to come by because these pieces are just breathtaking. And it's a wonderful experience to be here with Carletta in the gallery. So I'm just going to share a few of the comments and questions that I received in our Zoom session today. The first one is a comment, and I just wanted to use it to open up this portion of our event today. It says, Carletta, your delving into the history is wonderful. You have filled me up with a new awe at the miracle of the survival of the ancestors. I hope your work finds a home that will allow many thousands of people to see it up close. I am thankful you are sharing your creativity and spirit with all of us.
That's lovely.
It's a really lovely comment. So I want to open up with a couple questions. Where does inspiration for your work come from? And how do you conduct the research for your pieces? So the first one, where does inspiration for your work come from?
Well, you know, creation is such a interesting process. Generally, actually, what happens, a title pops into my mind. So, you know, my original identity is as a writer. And then it sort of transformed itself or attached itself to the visual world. And so, just like here, Book of the Bound. And I was like, well, what is a Book of the Bound? What does a Book of the Bound look like? And basically, once I commit to that title, then I began to hunt. And as I mentioned earlier, I would hunt Goodwill. I would hunt half-price books. And I was always, in my mind, looking for form. What form can I use upon which to, work the information? So what was the second part of that?
The second part is, how do you conduct the research for your pieces?
Well, actually, I remember, it must have been in the 80s. I read a narrative of Charles Ball. I can't remember the title, but I read that. And I was really fascinated by this history. How do you survive slavery? I mean, it is, 12 years a slave was the same, I began just reading these. I was obsessed with them. And so it led me down the rabbit trail, I could just say. So that is this connection of, now I can't tell you how the connection between slavery and textiles and all that were originated, but at some point, the poems, the text, and the artwork began to move together and become one.
We received several questions about, because just like the book Caste, it is obvious how much research has gone into this work. So we received several questions about the research process. How did you gather all the info? And if you could point us out to any of the documents or sources you use that people might want to look at.
Elizabeth Donnan's documents illustrative of the history of the slave trade. That was, now Elizabeth Donnan, she, as I mentioned, she has this correspondence, this business correspondence. These are the letters of marque, the ships, the ships, the titles of the ships. That's where I got Merchant Love.
Yeah.
Another one is Hugh Thomas's The Slave Trade. I think it's the history of the slave trade. But Hugh Thomas is a very thick tome, but it was really a difficult read. This is difficult history. So I do want to say this. This is really difficult history. And so what you need is, you need something to ground you, because it really does shift you and it rocks you. But I read countless narratives from the 18th and 19th century, mostly by men, but I read their narratives. Then I read works like Hugh Thomas's work. I just read everything I could get my hands on, in which expanded my understanding of the trade. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Now, I do have to tell you, you also, just go to a library, look online, you'll never, in fact, one day I said, I'll never hit bottom. You'll never hit the bottom. It is so huge, this trade. It transformed the world.
So we had some questions about, you explained how you look for the codexes of some of your pieces. They're deconstructed books. Can you describe the process of creating one, from the deconstruction of the book to making it into a piece of art?
Well, as I mentioned, you see, first I think about form. I don't even have the title. I looked through all these books. Most of these are all mass-produced books. So you go, well, I remember going to half-price books, and of course you go to fiction department, and they're all the same. The size, the shape, but they're all the same. So actually, that's why I liked in the front of half-price books, they had in fact, these large accordion-style books that I got. Those were like some kind of Disney something, but I was looking for form, and exactly so that I had a palette, a surface, and then, of course, I would just cover it with cloth. I would cover it, and during this process of the covering, I was also thinking, I can't tell you, I was just thinking, of course, I have all these little objects, and somehow the work would give me the thread in, if you understand what I mean. It would give me a way in, and I would say, so this is what this is about. Just like Angel Smell of Lilac. That face came up, and there was this narrative, these So I learned when the piece is finished what it's about. And this is what I was talking about, the process of creation. You start with an idea. I'm going to do Book of the Bound. But the question is, what is Book of the Bound? The hardest book was that book, Book of the Bound. It was the hardest book. I hunted and hunted, and I had several possibilities, but they were all too small. They didn't have the volume to translate the message. And there I was in Goodwill, I was in there, I have a part of their books. There was this old, and I said, that is it. It was literally the last book.
Wow.
It was the last one.
Wow. And it's the title book.
It was, but it was the hardest. It was the hardest, yes.
Just the experience of visiting the show, if you're able to, is tremendous. And what is one thing you hope that visitors carry with them after they leave this exhibit?
That's a good question. Well, actually, because what I think is kind of unique is this way of pairing the book, the text, and the textiles. They create, I think, a story that's not often told. And particularly, as I said before, I'm really still stuck on this whole idea about how people were purchased for like a yard of fabric. That is astounding to me. And when we think that, these were people who were weavers, dyers, they had skills. They were parents. They were children. They came from a society. And to watch this transaction happen and know that that was the price of your life, I still find that astounding.
So one of our themes this year for Tacoma Reads 2021 is healing, along with race and social justice. I'm wondering, as somebody visiting this exhibit and especially participating in the chain link of debtors, how do you think that this whole experience promotes healing in the individual?
Well, actually, I think that this is a way, particularly chain letter of debtors, because when we learn about the history of the trade, a lot of people are divorced from it. A lot of people see it as something way over there, and I don't have anything to do with it. But I say, and people have come to me and said, well, what should I do? And the first thing I say is you should find out if there is any connection between your family and enslavement. And if you were in this country in the 18th and the 19th century, maybe in the 17th, but I'd say 18th and 19th century in particular, then the whole country had a connection to slavery. Up north, the manufacturer, that's where the cloth came, the Negro cloth came down to be sold on those plantations. And so that, I think, if we were able to understand where we fit in this picture, we could begin to heal our nation. There is great shame. People are ashamed of being a slave. People have been ashamed of enslaving people. And people have admitted that in these letters. It is the fiction of freedom when so many people were not free. And so I think the great work of healing, the great work of healing is to witness our wound, is to be a witness to the wound. Because we have to say, you know, this is a beautiful thing. It's kind of off script, but this is the beautiful thing about today. The beautiful thing is the pandemic has just ripped open the illusion. And now we see, in a way, I think the country has never been able to see. We have the death of George Floyd. We have Native Americans rising up and saying, we are still here. They did, you know, the idea was that that they were supposed to go away or die, and the Africans were supposed to go all the way back to Africa. Well, that didn't happen. So we had to figure something else out. The thing is that this immense hunger that I alluded to, the desire, is in all of us. This desire for great wealth. But we have to decide what true wealth is. Is it in commodities? Is it in valuing a person based on their skin or based on what kind of clothes they have? That is where I think the healing has to happen. And this is just one small part of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My final question for Carletta is, where can we see your work on display next, and where can we learn more about you and your work?
Well, you can go to my website, carlettacarringtonwilson.com. I currently have 2 pieces in the Pacific Place, in the Onyx Fine Arts Collection, Onyx Gallery. They're 2 photographs, and they are of cotton. The one is called Spin, the other is Spun, and I have these figurines. Crazy. I never thought this was going to happen, but these figurines of a white woman, and then an African with bananas in one, and then the other, you know, this woman is dancing, so you spin, and he spun into a caricature. So I can continue to work on image, but anyway, that is what's on exhibit.